You're listening to the second season of the Study Podcast with Dr. Paul Wegner on Genesis. Today we're getting into a couple complicated topics, but first, Dr. Wegner is going to tell us a Hebrew word of the day.
Yes. Basically, I know you like having these Hebrew words each day. So what I did is this one is the word toledoth. And basically, it occurs 11 times in the book of Genesis. And I actually think it's for the structure of the book. It helps organize the book. So it means something like descendants, successors, generations, history, origin, something like that. But it always has, these are the toledoth, something like that. These are the generations or something.
Yeah.
And then it launches into basically who that person is, like the generations of Adam or the generations of Abraham or
And then
something
you're
like
getting narrative following that person or related to that person, essentially.
And what's interesting is at the end of each of them, before it goes into the next one, it says something like it's almost like a conclusion that starts the next one. You know, like in one of them talks about and men began to call upon the name of the Lord, and then men were the next one that's covered in the thing. So it's really interesting. It looks like it's intentional structure in the book.
Now, that reminds me a little bit of Isaiah, the seams kind of, like this idea of like there's kind of something in the text to alert you to like we're entering a new section. We're kind of completing one big thought and moving on to the next thing.
And I think toledoth helps organize it. Now, there's one interesting passage. There's 10 segments in the book of Genesis with those toledoth, but there's 11 times it's used. And one of them is at the beginning, and the other one's at the end of that section. So it's interesting, and it's on Esau of all people, because I'm wondering if it's letting us know this one is kind of separate from the structure of where Genesis is going, because basically it looks like he wants to get to Abraham and to do and Abraham's offspring are going to go through Isaac in that way. So it's interesting. So it looks like it's set off almost in the book, in the Bible itself, to let you know this one is
a side
different,
kind of piece almost, or
different
something
than the rest of them. I wonder.
That's interesting.
So that's our word for today.
In that case, you said toledoth is at the beginning and the end of the passage.
Yes.
And all the rest, toledoth is at the beginning, and then there's some kind of a conclusion.
Yes.
Okay. Gotcha.
And that means that the chapter 1 is and all the way to 2:4. That means that's like an introduction, because that's been a debate throughout history. Is chapter 1 the beginning and then it ends with 2:4, or is chapter 1 kind of separate by itself? And I think it's kind of an introduction by itself. So, and then each one starts it after that. So that's our Hebrew word for today.
I like it. Well, let's talk about the structure a little bit.
Okay, here's what I wanted to show you. And I use the word history for each one of them. So you can actually see. And so that I put chapter 1 through 2-3 as an introduction to the book. So you've got, and remember in chapter 3, it kind of ends with, and God rested on the seventh day. So, and then it goes into 2:4. So my understanding is you've got a structure here to help you know you've got an introduction, and I've called them conclusions. Do you see 2:3 says, and then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it because he rested from all the work that he had made and created, and then it goes into the history of the heavens and the earth. So
I see.
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's almost like a little conclusion there, and then it goes
that leads into the next thing.
Yeah. So I think that's neat. Okay, and our one down here where you see the history of Esau. Notice I said look at 36:9, because that's got the other toledoth structure in it. So that's our big picture, and how this helps us is it looks like the biblical text has a structure in the book all by itself. And I figure, man, if it's already got it there, we should be able to follow it, and it looks like we can follow it pretty well.
Well, let's hit them. Let's talk about. Why don't you give us a little bit of a summary of each section?
Okay. Oh, all right. The introduction, basically, I call it a prehistory, but it's basically talks about how the world was created. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, basically, and then it's going to show the structure. And I'll show you that structure later. Then you get to the history of the heavens and the earth. And that's interesting because most of the stuff that talks about is man being created
Right.
and that second creation story, and then sin coming into the world and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really deal. It tells how the earth and heavens were created, but more of what its purpose was. And
Right.
it seems like that seems to be the center.
Yeah.
And then in chapter 5, we've got Adam. And in that chapter, there's going to be actually even a genealogy that'll help us see where the biblical text is going.
Yeah.
And then in the third one is the history of Noah. That ends with the flood. So it starts with who he is and his sons and all that, and then ends with the flood. Then you've got, what's interesting is Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So you've got his sons being talked about.
Yeah.
But then at one point, it's going to take Shem, and that's the one it's going to follow,
Right.
and leave pretty much Ham and Japheth. And then you get to Shem, that's chapter 11, and it basically follows that structure. Then you get to Terah, which is interesting. You'd have thought it would have gone to Abraham,
Yeah.
but it actually goes to Terah, his father, because I think back at that time, the genealogy would have emphasized more the father than the person who's going to be used to help them know where everything fits.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then you get down to Ishmael and Isaac. Now, and then Esau. Remember, that's that ninth one.
Yeah, the slightly different one.
Yeah, and then you get to Jacob. Now, Jacob is not. He's not actually one. You thought he was going to be one of the patriarchs, but he's not. He's the person that's actually going to make it so that Israel stays alive during this time. But so Jacob is not one of our patriarchs usually, but he is he's crucial to the story because without him, they're never going to make it.
Right.
So it is interesting.
Yeah.
So that's how the book holds together.
That's great. That's really helpful.
Make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, let's look at chapter 1. Okay. So in mine, I actually argue, we'll look at Genesis 1:2. It says, "And the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters." The two words there that are in yellow, the formless and void, it's like a fun word to say there. It's a phrase, tohu vabohu. Formless and void, they sound alike even, so it even is a structure that's kind of interesting. But what's going to happen is so it tells us that it's formless and void in chapters 1 or verses 1 and 2. Then it starts forming creation, so it takes care of the formlessness. Yeah. And then verse 14, it starts talking about filling them, so it takes care of the voidness of it. So it's interesting. That structure is, I think, really interesting. So it starts like, I had a colleague that once says, when it's formless and void, he said it was like the moon, only watery, with water on it.
Yeah.
So it's almost like an empty, formless mass of material is how I understand it.
Yeah.
And then God starts creating it.
Yeah.
So that one has a really, I think, interesting structure. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Okay. Then each of the days actually have a structure. It's interesting, in the forming, you've got 3 days, and in the filling, you've got 3 days.
Sure, yeah.
And what also is interesting is that day 3 and day 6 have 2 parts to them, almost like an A and a B.
Yeah.
The first one talks about the land and stuff like that. Then it talks about the vegetation, and the same on this, it talks about the creatures on the earth in day 6.
And then man.
More specifically man, yeah. So it seems, again, like it's intentionally getting a structure for us.
Sure.
So I thought, again, and then you've got day 7 where God is resting.
Of course, yeah.
Okay? Makes sense?
Yeah.
All right. So I've put that the days are separated 1 to 3, but there's an introduction to each one, and God said.
Yeah, we're all familiar with that one, I think. Yeah.
And then the command, let there be, then a completion, and it was so. Approbation, and it was good, and then a conclusion. There was evening and morning and whatever day it was.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Each one of them seemed to have that kind of a structure too.
Yeah.
So I want to keep going because once we get to the end of chapter 1, I want to talk about, is that all it is? Because one of a good amount of scholars will say, it's got such a literary structure. Is that all that it's intended to do? And we'll come back to that question.
What? Is that all? What do you mean by all?
Is it just to create a structure? Because remember, day 7 is going to be to rest.
Yeah.
And some people thought that the first chapter is just to create a structure so that they could talk about Sabbath. And that's not really how God did it, but that's how he revealed it so that you could have the structure of the Sabbath day.
I see. Okay.
But I don't think that's enough, actually.
Yeah.
Okay, what's also interesting is, remember you have two different creation stories, basically. You have chapter 1 and chapter 2. And that's always been a real dilemma for scholars, what to do with the two creations. Now, partially the structure has already helped explain that. Remember, if there's an introduction talking about the forming and filling, then on the second part, you've got this place where God is going to have, because it was the Toledoth pattern talks about heavens and the earth and explaining what they're for.
Yeah.
And that seems to be more what chapter 2 is. He's talking about how his relationship with man and how it's going to work and what the whole purpose of creation was even for. So I think, and the names actually highlight that. Remember a while ago, the JEDP theory was really famous and thought you could divide between the structures by the names themselves.
Yeah.
I think now we're past that and realize that really didn't make much sense, or at least I don't think it does.
It got a bit granular.
Yeah.
Where you could look at like sections of a verse and say this is actually brought in by this group. Yeah.
And it never really fit very well, it seems, in my mind. But what was interesting is in chapter 1, it's centering on God's power and doing the creation. And so the word Elohim is used to center on his sovereignty, his power, his creative ability. But then chapter 2 brings in the name Yahweh, which Yahweh seems to emphasize more his relational nature and his personal nature. And even when you get to Exodus, where the name is actually finally brought in for the first time, it says, from now on, you're going to know me by the name Yahweh.
Yeah.
And then shortly after that, they have a covenant made with Adam or with the man like Adam or Abraham at that point. But there's going to have this relationship, and that seems to be the important part of why that name is used.
Yeah.
And so if we realize that names in Hebrew are very important and they have a reason for those names, it makes a lot more sense, even in the context. But if you think about it, that helps us to see how chapter 2 and chapter 1 are different. Chapter 1 is emphasizing the idea that here's this powerful God creating all this and forming and filling it, pulling back the waters so that the dry land can appear and all of that. So that idea of the sovereignty there. Then we get into the part where chapter 2 is basically centered around God's dealing with man and how he's taking care of him, and all these things were created so that man would have a good place to live.
Yeah.
So
when I was a student, an Old Testament student, at Gateway, actually, my professor, Dr. Urbino, he would illustrate this with an experiment in class. And he said every semester, every year, he got the same answers. He would ask people, if this was a movie, if chapter 1 is a movie and chapter 2 is a movie, who would be the narrator? And he said it never failed. Everyone always said James Earl Jones for chapter 1 and Morgan Freeman for number 2. But it illustrates that idea of kind of this...
Yeah, the different in personality.
Yeah.
Well,
that's relational kind of side in chapter 2, and the kind of it seems a bit warmer, know, but chapter 1 is kind of epic.
Yeah.
It reflects the power, this kind of all this coming out of nothing. You know?
That's good. So you've now got a good reason to have two different stories. And I've often wondered if chapter 2 is not more of a narrowing down of day 6. Even there, it's a little out of, because it says the animals were brought to Adam. So it's to see what he would name them and all that.
Right.
So it's seems like it's out of the structure. But if day 6 is him more this relational with animals and creation and with Adam, then I can see how that could be an emphasis on day 6.
Yeah.
So I think it's possible anyway. Okay, so here you've got, in the second one, it talks about creation before mankind is in verses 4 through 6, and it says there's no shrubs or no plants of the field, no rain or it says but a mist used to do it, and then the different order. So you've got a few things here, but it's interesting because, like when it says there's no shrubs or plants of the field, the explanation is because there's no man to till the ground. Okay,
right.
So it's already showing the relationship of shrubs in the field and stuff, and with mankind being necessary to keep it going.
Right.
We know that weeds and grass and stuff like that grows, and they don't need a man to plant them.
Yeah.
But I actually think what that means when it says plants of the field, it's really specifically talking about ones that are put in the field
that would be cultivated,
that need planting and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Because the other ones in Genesis 1 didn't talk about it; just talked about the plants and the trees and the stuff like that. It didn't say plants of the field. So I think that's more specific.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
yeah.
and then
the relationship being like man dealing with the plants.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. And then it is interesting in that there's a different order in chapter 2 between the animals and man. Because remember, man, and in chapter 1, man's created as like the epitome, the last thing. But in chapter 2, it's actually he actually he makes the animals and brings them to Adam, and he names them. And so there's that personal connection, but it's also suggesting that there's that relationship. So I'm wondering if chapter 1, in that big picture of how they were created, is more general how they were done, and then this one is more specifically day 6 how it was done.
Yeah.
And so at least that's kind of how I understand what's going on.
Yeah.
All right. And in chapters chapter 2 verses 7 through 17, you've got man created out of the dust of the ground, and then he's placed in this garden, and then told not to eat of the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Right.
So once again, a command and relationship there, and then goes to chapter 8 or verses 18 through 25, talks about woman being made as a helper for man, and then also the name Ish and Isha are a play on the words.
Man and woman, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, sorry. It's almost like the word Isha has a feminine ending on it. So it's like almost like a feminine man.
Right.
It's almost like what it sounds like it's doing. Yeah. So it's a real play on the words there.
Yeah.
And then you've got, there's another place that there's a play on words. The word naked in chapter, I think it's verse 25 of chapter 2. And then in chapter 3, verse 1, it's the word urim. It sounds like the same word, but it's a homonym.
Okay.
It has a different meaning, but it sounds the same.
Yeah.
And it's the word. So in the one, it's they were naked. In this one, he's crafty. So it's like our word for hole. We have we can talk about a hole in the ground. Or the whole class.
Yeah.
And
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So the word garim has that meaning, or it sounds the same, but it's got two different meanings.
And those are naked or crafty, something kind of like that.
And I think it was done to pull these two chapters together to show that they actually are related. There's a link word there, probably.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So anyway, it's interesting in that when it talks about them being naked and not ashamed, that they have nothing to hide. So it seems like it's giving you a hint of what creation was like. And even there, the relationship between man and woman was totally different than what it is now.
Sure.
So I think that chapter 2 has got so many hints that it's talking about relationship between God and man. Remember, that's the chapter that talks about him walking in the cool of the day, God walking in the garden in the cool of the day to meet with man. So you've got all those little elements to help you to see that.
Well, and it does seem, in chapter 1 we get that it's good. Creation is good.
Yeah.
And it does seem like in chapter 2 there's a lot more detail.
Yeah.
Well, what makes it good, maybe?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Okay, let's look at the next one. There are a few other things in chapter 1 that we'd like to go back and talk about. Like in chapter 1, verse 11, it says, and God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees, bearing fruit after their kind. With it, their seed in them on the earth, and it was so. So I wanted to talk a little about what the word kind means.
Okay.
And it seems like in science, the difference between a genus and species, the species is the more generic name, and then the genus is the more generic name, and then species is the more specific name.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that the word kind is actually somewhere between those two classifications.
Yeah.
Because there are, you can cross it seems like we can find some real close connections between where that kind would split.
Yeah.
Because notice it says that these fruit-bearing trees were created after their kind.
Yeah.
So my understanding is that when God created the first plant, let's say an apple tree, he didn't have to go and continue to make a new apple tree every time he wanted one. He's
Right.
now made it so that they can reproduce.
Continue, yeah.
But they only reproduce within a certain limit. An apple tree doesn't become an orange tree,
Yeah.
or a lemon tree, or something
Right, but you can
else.
have several varieties of
Yeah.
apples.
So there's the generic name would put them all into that classification.
Yeah.
But then there can be specific ones.
Mm-hmm.
So as I understand it, that's like when we cross two, like if you cross a horse and a donkey, you get a mule.
Yeah.
But he's insterile,
Right.
Infertile, so he can't reproduce.
Yeah, there can't be more mules from that line, essentially.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
I also looked up a ligert. That's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
lion and a tiger.
Yeah.
And what I found out in those is that the males are infertile, but the females can actually reproduce.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So it's got something to do with the chromosomes and how many they have. But it was interesting. So it seems like we can get real close to where that kind separates.
Yeah.
And I grew up in Iowa, and a lot of the times in the summer they would go and detassel corn. And what you do with the tops of the corn plant is they mix those with another variety, and you can make what's a hybrid,
Yeah.
one that's disease resistant or
Sure.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
And that works, because that's within a kind.
Yeah.
But you don't, once again, you can't breed or cross that with something else.
Yeah, like a potato or something.
And So there are those boundaries that are in there, and I thought that's actually helpful for us to realize.
Because that tells us about order.
Yeah, and also that also is going to tell us about whether evolution actually will work. It would seem like the biblical text is actually telling us microevolution is going to work. That's where a hybrid kind of thing comes in.
Development, yeah.
But it seems like it's saying that macroevolution won't work. You can't go from one species to another.
Right. Interesting, yeah.
So I think that was helpful to help us know how that works. And then the other one is, what does the word good mean?
Oh, that's a good one to look at.
Yeah. So in Genesis 1:31, it says, and God saw that all he had made, and behold, it was very good. And remember, all the way through after each days, it actually
that
said,
was a concluding kind of remark, basically.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but on day 6, it means very good. But at that time, what does it mean to be really good? The word has a range of meanings, and it can mean morally good or bad, or actually good.
In Hebrew, the Hebrew word.
Yeah, the word can mean morally good. But in this sense, it doesn't really mean that, I don't think. I don't think that would make sense in its context. I think what it more likely means is suitable or fitting. So what he's saying is that I've just made this day, let's say, to in the perfect way that I need it, so that it'll be suitable for what I'm going to do with it. And I think that's what God is saying for each of those days. And then at the very end, he says, this is perfect. This is exactly what I want to do. That I made creation so that it would fulfill the purpose that I wanted it to do.
Yeah.
And I think that then helps us understand. Now, that also fits in Isaiah chapter 39. Do you remember I think we talked about it, and I think it's verse 8 or 9, where it says, and Hezekiah says, oh, well, that is good, because at least there won't be, we won't go into captivity during my time. It makes him sound like a real jerk.
Right.
But if it means more like fitting or suitable, remember Hezekiah was a good king.
Right.
So if they went into captivity during his time, the message God would be sending is, look, you be as good as you want, but I'm still going to send you into captivity.
Right.
So I think it makes a lot of sense then to say, no, it means suitable or fitting.
Yeah.
And that's in the creation here, it fits perfectly.
Yeah.
So
And then I think maybe even the sixth. I mean, on the last day, on the sixth day when it says very good, that kind of reinforces that. I think even more that this task is complete.
Yeah,
all the creation has come together.
Yeah,
and it is it's fitting, right? It's
perfect for what he wants.
Right. Yeah. Now I've got another question for this.
Oh, okay.
For our days, because we have at the end we say of each day God said it was good, and then we had evening and morning, right?
Yeah.
Now my question, I've heard this before, is like this question of how is there evening and morning when the sun, stars, that stuff doesn't come in till the third day?
Yeah.
So how do we measure days?
Yeah. My understanding is that, remember, it's like in day one, he separates the light from the darkness.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding is that at that point, there's some kind of material or light-bearing material that he separates into one part of the sky, and then it's separated from the dark. So if you've got the earth and it's rotating between what's on the side that's emitting light and what's on the other side that's not, it would give the appearance of day, just like what we would normally expect. But it's not then until day 3 that he actually creates the sun and the moon and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So you then actually have those bodies that would do it. But before that, it's got just a light-bearing source over there, not formed into our sun or moon or something like that.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so I think it'll still work
Yeah.
and be a logical reason what's going on.
Yeah.
So
that's good.
That's at least how I understand it.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question, because we do have light and darkness separated at the beginning,
Yeah.
and we just have those very much associated with
Yeah.
the sun,
And remember, the purpose at that point is to start forming it.
Yeah.
And he doesn't have to form it all at once.
Sure.
I had a colleague that once said that when he separated light from the day, that was really, he was starting to create time. Because once you have light and you have darkness and it's starting to rotate, that's more the element of time than it is the sun or moon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating idea.
Yeah, so I think he was right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
Okay, let's go to the next one.
It's fitting.
Yes. All right. I know you want to know where the Garden of Eden is, right?
I'm so glad you put this slide in here. Yeah. So tell us what this means.
Okay. There are 2 rivers we don't know. One's like in Hebrew, it's like the Jumper and the Flowing River. But the 2 that we know are the Tigris and Euphrates.
Right.
And those 2 would make some sense. And, my guess is, and I don't know this for sure, but my guess is the Tigris and Euphrates could be pretty much in the same spot as they were, even because remember, now this is before the flood, so the flood could change
topography.
and stuff like that. But usually the mouth of the spring would probably stay the same place, and then it would be the where the water would run that would probably would change.
Yeah.
But up in the north, up in there, the Tigris and Euphrates River, their source is only like, I think it's like 400 feet or from each other. So it might be a little more than that, but it's something like that. But then they flow down opposite sides of the mountain, and they create these 2 rivers. So my guess is that would be one place where it actually could be, up in that northern area where those 2 rivers start. And then the other place is where the 2 rivers actually come together. So down here at the mouth of the river is possibly the other place where that could have happened.
Yeah.
My guess, though, is that there's been erosion in that area. So if there was any Garden of Eden there, it could have been washed away. And my guess is that maybe in the flood, it was actually removed anyway.
Oh, wow.
I
don't think I've heard that idea before.
Because remember, the Garden of Eden still had that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So Adam, I assume, at any point could go back. He'd have to deal with the cherubim, of course. But he could go back, and if he did, then we'd have a problem. So I think that God just removed it after the flood and took care of that. That's why I won't have an expedition to see the Garden of Eden this summer. Yeah. All right. Okay, so that's probably will help you get that. Remember, I told you in chapter 2, there's that word for mist.
Yeah.
I wanted to clarify that because that word aid can actually mean, some people suggested it was a spring
yeah.
that shot up and watered the garden. And the other possibility is it could be a mist that came down. The only other place that word occurs is in Job 36, verse 27. And I think, here's what it says. He draws up the drops of water. They distill rain from the mist. And that's our word aid. So it seems like that's the other place. And I put Job quite early.
Yeah.
And if it is, that would kind of fit that kind of a time period well. And I actually think that they would understood it as that, the mist that is brought together and then it rains.
Yeah.
So I think that probably at some point God had some kind of a mist that watered the garden instead of it. I mean, it would seem like to me that if it is a spring that shoots up and waters it, and then you'd need man to almost irrigate.
Yeah.
If you had the mist, you wouldn't actually need that.
That's true.
Like.
Yeah.
So that's how I understand it.
Yeah.
I also wanted to go back and talk about that play on words for man
ish.
and woman.
Yeah.
So here's Genesis 2:23. It says, "And the man said, 'This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She should be called woman because she's taken out of man.'" And even our English word, you can see they're related.
Yeah.
So not often do we have something like that mirrors the Hebrew.
Yeah, like a word play in multiple languages. Yeah.
So the word for man is ish in Hebrew, and then it's isha in the word for woman is isha in Hebrew.
Yeah.
And that comet's hey on the end, those two letters on the end, like the vowel and the consonant, are the actual part that makes it a feminine part.
It's a feminine
word.
Yeah.
So it's almost like I said before, it's almost like a feminine man because
Yeah.
it's putting that feminine ending on that word for
Yeah.
man. So it's an interesting play on words.
Yeah, that is a very fascinating.
Yeah.
It's amazing the kind of. I think that really goes to show the literary skill involved in the writing of this book. I mean, not only just the structure, but just wordplay, stuff like that. That's fairly complicated.
And what I wanted to also help try to see is that structure. You could this is an amazing book to see that structure. I believe Moses wrote it. If Moses wrote it, he's actually a really skilled writer.
Yeah.
Because he's pulling. Now I don't know where he got all the information from.
Right. But it's very organized.
Yeah.
Logical. I
I
think
guess-
it's hard for us to see sometimes. I'll confess, I just read through Genesis. A friend of mine are doing the ESV, read through the Bible in a year.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, there's times where you're just like, this is very foreign to me, with the genealogy stuff. But seeing that structure, that does bring a lot of sense to it.
That's what I was hoping that would give you some structure and say, oh, maybe it's not quite as foreign as I thought it was.
Yeah.
Now, you're still going to have things like in chapter 3 where you've got a serpent talking, apparently.
Yeah.
So you still have elements like that. But at least there's a structure to this, a flow. You know that the author was purposely putting these elements in here. So I think that's helpful.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, another thing I wanted to show you is there are different creation stories. And so we've got the Urdu Genesis, the Atrahasis, the Gilgamesh epic, Enuma Elish, and the Memphite theology. The last one is basically from Egypt.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that I've often, people have often said, well, you see it in the commentaries all the time that these are just mirroring the ancient Near Eastern stories and stuff. And we were talking a little earlier about this, but that when you actually start looking at them, you can actually see that the biblical text is significantly different than the others.
Yeah.
Like one of them has that. Well, actually, several of the Sumerian ones talk about the flood being brought in because the men were noisy.
Right.
At first the men were brought in to do the work so the gods didn't have to.
Yeah.
But then they got so noisy that the gods couldn't sleep. And I'm going, man, if a God could make man to do his job, couldn't he also make him without voice boxes? I'm going, that seems like a fairly silly thing. Something, if you could create man, you could certainly make him silent, I would think. Where the biblical text argues, no, it's sin in man that's caused the problem. And that seems to be a better answer for why would they be destroyed in the flood?
Sure.
And then I often also say, now, in the biblical text, we actually have an ark that will float, But in the other ones, one is a cube, which we know a cube won't actually float,
Right.
and another one is like a cone.
Yeah.
Neither of those objects that they made would have worked.
Yeah.
So again, we've got a biblical text that actually has an ark that actually floats compared to ones that really won't work.
Right.
So again, seems a lot more logical to me.
Yeah.
So I think that if we go to the biblical text, we can see that it has an authority or at least a logic that the other ones don't have.
Yeah.
So I think that's helpful.
Yeah, I did a little bit of when I was in college. We read some of this stuff, comparing like flood stories, a little bit of creation stories, and then like early laws and codes like the Code of Hammurabi and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it is funny because there are some. I think when you take a step back, you can see some similarities like in the really, really big picture. But if you start looking close, it's very different. I mean, certainly in those laws, you could see a very different value system. There were a lot of unique things, I think, in Hebrew law of just, caring for outsiders. How do you treat outsiders as, not second-class citizens? There's just a lot of interesting things that really display a pretty big difference, I think.
And remember, the biblical text is arguing that these laws were to make you different from all the rest. So where the laws overlap is probably that they were real just law and it made sense.
Yeah.
But then there's going to be things in there that they didn't need to put in, but God put them in there so that it would show that they are different than the other people.
Set apart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is logical.
Yeah.
I wanted to show you just a little more and explain some of these. The Urdu Genesis is dated to around 1600 BC, and it preserves a section that contains both the creation of mankind and the flood story. The flood lasted for 7 days and nights, and it was sent because of excessive noise for the humans. So that gives you some clue. 7 days and 7 nights. We've had floods that long, and they haven't drenched the earth and made it so that it was. So it just seemed like is not as logical.
Yeah.
Atrahasis our copy of it goes back to about 1600, but it may go back even further from what we can tell. It's copies of things.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so maybe back 1800. It contains another Sumerian creation and flood story, and it begins with the creation of Anu, who rules the sky, and then Enlil, who rules the earth, and Enki, who rules the fresh water, basically.
Okay.
Then these are created these ones create lower deities to do the work. But these deities got tired of working, and thus the God solution is to wipe them out. Okay? So that idea of noisy again and sending the flood doesn't seem to be as logical to me.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right. And Atrahasis, one of the people gets saved in that flood story. Very similar to Noah. Yeah. So it is interesting. All right, and then Gilgamesh epic is an old. It could go back even to 2100 BC.
Yeah.
It's an old Babylonian account, mentions the gods made man, but it does not say how. It just talks that they did. The lower deities get tired of working, and thus the God solution is to create man to do the work. But then again, they become noisy and disturb the gods. Okay, so the flood wipes them out. This one also has a hero, Sheptim or whatever, and he's the one that's in a dream. The gods tell me they're going to send a flood, and so that he makes this boat. It's in almost like the shape of a ziggurat,
like a temple, kind of.
Yeah,
is that kind of the idea? Kind of pyramid-y type thing.
Yeah, it says the shape of it. It says it was 7 levels and doors and windows covered with pitch. And again, the flood lasts for 6 days and nights. So a ziggurat or at least a cone kind of shape is not gonna float. And the days for are just not long enough. So it seems like to me we've got some pretty good evidence that our biblical text is actually more logical anyway. Yeah. Okay, then Numa Elish, and it talks about there being a combination of sweet water and salt water, which then finally. Actually, when they differentiate, they become gods. So Sweetwater is
interesting.
Apsu, and saltwater is Tiamat.
Yeah.
And then the union of these two gods bring about younger gods or lesser gods. Marduk is one of the younger gods. He defeats Tiamat and makes the heaven and earth out of her corpse. So you got this is
Right.
and then at the end, the men are too noisy and they get destroyed by a flood. So there's certain elements that have
They're really concerned about
that
how
noise,
noisy
aren't they?
men
Yeah.
were.
Mephite theology is the next one. It's probably the latest of all of them, like only about 700 BC. But Ptah talks about as being the maker of creation, though it doesn't, and he makes the other ones, the other gods, but it doesn't really tell how or anything like that. So that's how I wanted to make sure you knew a little about them, so you could see the logic of why we think they're.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, some of these elements that are similar between the other ones have just kind of someone's got to do the work.
Yeah.
We'll kind of create some lower group of beings to do the work. Someone's got to do it, and then we're annoyed by them basically.
Yeah,
and that's why we're going to kind of punish them, which is. Or wipe them out. Maybe it's not even really having to do with punishment, but it's so different from the biblical narrative where there's work becomes hard because of sin, and the flood comes to kind of cleanse the earth from evil of sin. It's got a really different flavor to it.
Yeah. And I was actually going to say, you can see where these ones came. Oh, well, first of all, a lot of people, scholars will say, well, look, some of these Sumerian texts come before the biblical text. So even if, let's say that the New Militias, that one's one of the later ones. Let's say the Gilgamesh epic, if it goes back 2000 BC, let's say, then if Moses wrote the Pentateuch in 1400, even the biblical text says it's later, right? So looking at these, clearly you've got obviously the biblical text must have copied from these others.
Just took some ideas or something.
But if you think about it, Moses is not the first person that's being talked about in the biblical text.
Yeah.
We've got Adam and Eve that go clear back to the beginning. We've got Abraham that are way before Moses. So even Moses' recording is talking about events that far surpassed or were much earlier than him.
Yeah.
So I would actually say it's not really fair to compare like the Gilgamesh epic to the biblical text, because the biblical text is claiming to contain information that goes way before when Gilgamesh would.
That maybe was passed down through.
Sometimes
spoken.
it can be oral. I could even, from about 3,000 on, it could be written even.
Sure.
Because we do have writing that takes place then. So,
but it was like compiled or kind of written in the form we have it as.
By
in 1400 or so. Yeah.
Yeah. So at least that helps make some sense out of that.
Yeah.
So you can't just argue that these ones precede the biblical text. It doesn't sound like that's necessarily true.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. This next one is amazing when I found this out.
Okay.
Remember, I'm trying to show you how structures are there, how much structure there is in the book of Genesis. And at this one, there's three genealogies in the text. One is in chapter 4, talking about Cain's genealogy. Then chapter 5 is Seth's genealogy. And then you get to chapter 11, and it's basically the sons and daughters of Shem's line, okay? So it goes a lot further. What I think is interesting is for some reason they all try to get to 10 people. Like if you look at Cain's, notice he has to put in, not just, usually it's one son and then it goes on. This one, you have to put in all
two
the
sons
and a daughter.
Right.
Look at Naama is a daughter and she's put in there. And I'm going, wow, that's unusual for a genealogy to do that.
Yeah.
And then in chapter 5, you've got a couple things that are interesting. In chapter 4, it doesn't say anything about, and they had other sons and daughters. In chapter 5, it does. So it seems like usually when they have children, it's more like God's blessing them. So it's suggesting that this one is more of a blessed line because they have these other children too.
Yeah.
And then notice it gets down to Noah. And then it adds on Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Yeah.
Not in the same way that it had in the other ones, but in a way that they're almost like tacked on. Because in the rest of the history, they need to know who these people are.
Yeah.
But they don't seem to be intrinsically connected to the genealogy.
Right.
So it's, again, getting to 10 people. Then you get to chapter 11. It also has sons and daughters talked
And that's
about.
Shem's genealogy.
Yeah, it's basically his offspring.
Yeah.
Because remember, what's going to happen is the other two, the Ham and Japheth, are not going to be talked about. It's going to be the Shem's line that God's going to work with.
Yeah.
So then you've got you get down to Abraham, which is exactly where you'd expect.
Yeah.
But then Nahor, Haran, and Lot are tacked on because again they're going to need to talk about those because in the history,
right?
They learn about those.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting. Now, I wished I knew why. I still don't know why 10 is a specific number.
Yeah.
And, we actually have genealogies in other sources in the ancient Near East, but 10 is never a common number. Like sometimes there's 6, sometimes 7, but 10 is not a normal genealogy thing. So we're not exactly sure why. Now,
interesting. Yeah.
It's similar to what we've got in Genesis or in Matthew 1. Do you remember in Matthew 1 it splits the genealogy up into 14 in each of them, and the name 14 you can work with it, and it spells out the name David. So there seems to be like a logical reason why they wanted to memorize this genealogy.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if 10 has a similar kind of structure to try to help you remember that.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's the yellow ones are the ones on this genealogy that are really hard to explain.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was interesting. And then one other thing is in chapter 4, you've got the sixth one is Lamech, who's really evil.
Right.
Remember, he kills a person for wounding him or whatever.
Yeah.
And then Seth, number 7, is Enoch, who walks with God. So it seems like, again,
yeah, kind of opposite.
and you've got some hints that suggest one's a good genealogy and one's kind of more not as good.
Right.
So it's interesting.
Yeah, that is very interesting.
Yeah. Okay, I thought that one would be helpful for you.
Yeah.
All right, so those are the structures that I found.
Yeah. It's very fascinating.
And
very helpful for me, having just read it.
Oh, good. Good. Well, if that's true, then it seems like the logic of what God was doing, he's putting this structure in here, and we can now see how they fit together. And I think the genealogy one is actually pretty helpful because now you can see where he's going. Obviously, when you get to one other thing I should show you about this one. Do you see the guy named Peleg? Number 5.
Shem's genealogy. Yeah.
When you get up to 4 is he Eber, and then Peleg is here. In genealogy, the 5th, Genesis 5 genealogy. I'm sorry, not in that one. In this one, there's 2 parts to it, and one of them goes to Peleg, and one goes to another person. And it says for Peleg, it says, and at this time the earth during his time the earth was divided. And it doesn't make, it didn't
really explain that.
Yeah, it doesn't really let you know. But I think at that point, it's telling you that it's going down the genealogy of Peleg, not the other guy. And so I think it's helpful there. And then you get down to Abraham. So I think that's a structure.
Yeah.
So it helps us to see where we're going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you to put a button on this.
Okay.
So I think I saw a hint at maybe one of the first, second slides you showed. What is the structure telling us about the general main idea of the book of Genesis?
Yeah. I think it tells us a couple things. First of all, you're seeing that God is very ordered. At the creation story where there's even the days have got a very set structure. Oh, we had actually mentioned some people just think that the creation story is like that because it's just giving the structure so that they can have Exodus be the 7th day, which is the Sabbath. So it's giving an explanation of why there is a Sabbath. But it seems like to me there's more than that. That structure is showing how God's creating everything in a order. It's all functioning well, and it all fits together.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the better answer as to why there's such a structure here. And I think I still would argue this is how God did it, but he's done it in a way to let us know that God is a God of order. And big picture, we see that in even the message of where he came from and how he created Genesis, and then how he's picking out a person and showing that line of Abraham and how God's going to use them.
Yeah.
So it seems like to me the book of Genesis is one that helps get that structure to know what God's going to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
So I think that's the purpose.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that.
All right.
What do you want to talk about next time? There's so many great things in Genesis.
I think we better go to Genesis 3.
Okay.
And see what's going to happen
man.
in there, because there's tons of
There's a
stuff.
lot in there.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that'll be fun.
All right.
Okay, that's good.
We'll see you next week.